Okay, got it. To the cloud, David.
Okay, now it
But-
shows up.
Yeah, I'll just ask for an
Well,
extra.
that's fine. If it's recording, that's
Yeah.
fine. Looks like we're on Zoom, and then we're recording for YouTube, and we're streaming to Facebook. So we're all set. One second.
Make notice that I want a bonus on that.
Yeah, I have 1 second. We need to get all our co-hosts in. I've got Forrest and I have Bronwyn. I don't see Monty. There he is.
There he is. Yeah.
Okay. Let's make Monty a co-host.
I am here, but now that people are so good at muting themselves, I feel almost of no use, but I'm glad to be a co-host.
Okay, well, we're going to put you to work presenting here pretty soon, so enjoy your leisure. Okay, here we go. Proverbs Chapter 2. My child, if you accept my words and treasure up my commandments within you, making your ear attentive to wisdom and inclining your heart to understanding, if you indeed cry out for insight and raise your voice for understanding, if you seek it like silver and search for it as for hidden treasures, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. For the Lord gives wisdom. From his mouth comes knowledge and understanding. He stores up sound wisdom for the upright. He is a shield to those who walk blamelessly, guarding the paths of justice and preserving the way of his faithful ones. Then you will understand righteousness and justice and equity, every good path. For wisdom will come into your heart, and knowledge will be pleasant to your soul. Prudence will watch over you, and understanding will guard you. It will save you from the way of evil, from those who speak perversely, who forsake the paths of righteousness, who walk in the ways of darkness, who rejoice in doing evil and delight in the perverseness of evil, those whose paths are crooked and those who are devious in their ways. Therefore, walk in the way of the good and keep to the paths of the just. For the upright will abide in the land, and the innocent will remain in it. But the wicked will be cut off from the land, and the treacherous will be rooted out of it. Okay, let's begin with prayer. Again, we begin with thanks, our Creator and Sustainer. We're thankful for each other. We're thankful for this technology. We're thankful for the Bruinsmas who can be with us for so far away. We're thankful for Reinder and his presentation today. He brings to us wisdom, as Proverbs spoke of, and we long to have at least some of that wisdom ourselves. Help us now as we launch a new series under his leadership. We pray in Christ's name, amen. Okay, the name of this series is Christian Profiles in Courage, Loyalty, and Responsible Dissent. We will do about 4 sessions, and then we'll take a break and have Gary Chartier and Ron Graybill, and then we'll come back for several more sessions. So we have a feast before us, and we begin right now. Over to Dr. Bruinsma.
Thank you, David. And I just mentioned that I am beginning to recognize many of the faces and many of the names as I've been to your class a number of times, and no doubt having such a long series will help to get to know you even better. So I hope that the audience will stay with us to the end, David, and that they will not feel after 3 or 4 times that they need a change of diet. But I'll do my best to keep it interesting.
We're going to have a good time, not to worry.
Okay, we'll see. It's nice anyway to be with you tonight. Even though, you know, the time difference is a bit challenging, but it's not too bad. Of course, the thing is that I'm back to preaching again since the COVID situation in the Netherlands is more or less under control. At least that's what it's being claimed. In the churches that I've been to the last couple of weeks, most of the people have returned and are no longer afraid to come together. And it appears that the number of people that are returning to church, let's say it has not suffered from the Corona period. And actually, the church in the Netherlands has been doing reasonably well in the last 2 years. And when you look, for instance, at income, tithe income, that has risen quite sharply. Whereas, of course, when the coronavirus started to being felt, there was great fear that that would cause enormous problems. Well, of course, we should not measure everything by money, certainly not. But it's encouraging to see that we're coming back more or less to normal. Okay, I have a PowerPoint, and that is always the technical challenge to make sure that that gets on the screen. Let's see whether we... Is it there?
No.
No? Let's see. Okay. I should do something else, yeah. Here we go. There we are, I think.
Yes.
Oh,
Okay. Christian profiles in courage, loyalty, and responsible dissent. When talking about this title, that's what we came up, David and myself, as we discussed it. And I think that the overall title, Christian Profiles in Courage, is very important. I was keen on having the word responsible in there, loyalty and dissent, yes, dissent, but I would focus also on the word responsible. And so we'll see in the coming weeks why that word is, in my view, quite important. The content of the series. Today is a general introduction, talking about some of the important overall issues. And then I'm going to deal with 7 examples of loyal, responsible dissenters. And we'll do so by each time having a short biographical description and then placing the person in his or her historical, cultural, and religious context. Looking at the main issues the person was dealing with, contributions that that person made in thought and action. And then the special issue is to point out the critical and creative loyalty that people had towards their faith community. And then, and particularly also in the discussion, how the main issues that we meet with that particular person impact on Seventh-day Adventist Christianity today. So I hope that will give a good backbone to what we are going to do. Here are the names of the people that I'm planning to discuss. Next week, we'll start with a Dutchman, Desiderius Erasmus, who was a Roman Catholic, lived in the 15th, 16th century, And some of these special issues in his case were religious liberty, freedom in biblical and theological scholarship. I hope you won't mind that I will then come with a second Dutchman, Jacobus Arminius. He was Reformed, and he is important because of his defense of free will versus predestination. Well, you know, the fact that we have two Dutchmen here to start with is not so strange, because theology was very much in the domain of a number of nations, people from a number of nations. And it has been said about the Dutch that if you had one Dutchman, you had a theologian. If you had two Dutchmen, you had a church. And if you had three Dutchmen, you had a schism. Well, after the two Dutchmen, we'll deal with John Wesley, a truly important one in this series, a Methodist, British, and of course, Methodism very much related also to Seventh-day Adventism. Then after the break that David was mentioning, we'll come to people that are somewhat closer to our time. And it's good to have that 2-week break, I think, but it's also necessary because Afi and I will be in Germany those 2 weekends, as I have commitments there in the 2 weekends that finally can take place again physically in person in Eisenach, the city of Luther, and the next week at Friedensau, our university. So when we come back from that break, there is first of all Elisabeth Schlusser Fiorenza, and she is one of the key feminist theologians doing theology from a woman's perspective. How does that affect our picture of God? And there are some other important issues that we are going to look at. I will combine Dorothee Sulle and Leonardo Boeuf, talking about political theology and liberation theology, and what they, in the way they try to educate the churches that they were members of. And then getting towards the close, Hans Küng, very fascinating person. He died in April this year, very important theologian. And we'll then look particular at what he was saying about the meaning of the church. And I would like to finish with Desmond Ford, a loyal dissenter in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And I think he was also a responsible dissenter, although not all might agree with that. He was from Australia, and he died just 2 years ago. I had the privilege of meeting with him shortly before his death, when I was in Australia for a camp meeting, and met his wife, and she said, well, Des would like to see you. Would you be able to come? And that was a very, very pleasant afternoon that I spent with Desmond Ford and his wife. Well, we'll come back to that then. That would be the first Sabbath in December. Some of the basic elements for today, when we're talking about dissent and loyalty, like to mention a few things about authority, freedom of conscience, loyalty, dissent, and integrity. These are some of the things that I want to touch upon this morning or this evening. Starting with authority. And it's important to note that authority is more than power. The Latin roots for that word are the words auctor, auctoritas. meaning something like invention, advice, influence, command. But in the Middle Ages, this word acquired a meaning of the right to rule or command, the power to enforce obedience. Now, in the Latin translation of the Bible, the Vulgate, the traditional translation used for ages by the Catholic Church, there is in Hebrews the word auctor, fidei, the author of our faith. And I think we would agree that that certainly does not emphasize authoritarian power. And the Greek archekon, that is the equivalent in Greek in Hebrews 12, has the meaning more of pioneer, precursor, initiator. These words and the related Greek words, dynamos, exousia, power, they do not convey authoritarian power, coercion, or force. I think that is an important basis when we talk about authority, that we do not automatically conclude that it has to do with power and with the ability or the freedom to coerce or to force people. There is a need for authority in society, and certainly also in organizations. You need structure, and sometimes that structure may take the form of some kind of hierarchy. Some people are more important in that structure than others. It's a relationship between the various stakeholders. Authority, is related to ownership. It has to do with rules for decision making. Who can make the rules? Where are the responsibilities? By whom? How are the responsibilities divided? And all of this has ethical and moral dimensions. Church authority, however, has a different kind of taste to it. It is different from secular authority. It should be. The church is Christ's church, and God is the source of all authority. That is something that the church must always remember, that whatever authority people in the church have, it is delegated authority. And it's always subject to divine revelation, to what God wants us to do, to what we learn from the Bible. And it has to be coupled to, related to the fundamental biblical principle of the priesthood of all believers. Different roles for the members, but fundamental equality in status of all believers. So whatever we say about church authority, these are some of the things that we need to keep in mind. It's different from secular authority. It's delegated authority because God is the source of all authority. And although there are functional differences, there is a fundamental equality in status of all believers. I'm quoting from a journal here, and let me see, I need to, yes. It is clear beyond dispute that Jesus established something entirely new in the authority which he conferred on the church. Authority as a function of love and as an operation of the Spirit has no precedent in societies which existed in Old Testament times or in the Hellenistic world, nor does it appear in social ethics of ancient and modern times. So quite clearly, this John Mackenzie, he says that church authority is something totally different from all other kinds of authorities. And what Jesus wanted to see in his church is a kind of authority that is based on love, is an operation of the Spirit, and it's something totally different from what you see, or should be totally different from what you see in other organizations, other societies. From the same source, Mr. Mackenzie, we always face the danger, and I think this is really crucial. We face the danger that the structure of the church will take on forms of secular society, and that the church will employ means proper to secular society. When the church becomes a power structure, unless that power be the power of love, it takes on a secular character. When we look at reality today in Christianity, and certainly also when we look at the history of Christianity, we see that has all too often been true. That the church has taken on forms of secular society, and it became a power structure, but not a structure in which the power of love would be predominant. So I think this is a very vital principle, an important statement to keep in mind. The authority by which the Christian leader leads is not power, but love, not force, but example, not coercion, but reasoned persuasion. Leaders have power, but power is only safe in the hands of those who humble themselves to serve. Who humble themselves to serve. Well, because the nature of the church authority is servanthood. Moses in Deuteronomy was dealing with the people of Israel who were saying that they wanted to have a king. Well, no, let me restate it. Samuel in Deuteronomy 17, verse 20. And whether Moses wrote that or somebody else, well, let's not get into that this morning. But Samuel had to deal with the fact that the people of Israel wanted to have a king. And there we have a kind of summary of what a king must be like. And the king must not consider himself better than his brothers. A king must be somebody who serves rather than rules. Jesus said, the Son of Man did not come to be served. He came to serve. I am among you as one who serves. And we find the absolute final example of servanthood of Jesus Christ in the rite of foot washing when he washed the feet of his disciples. In John 13, we find the story. In leadership theories, much is made the last couple of decades of the theory of servant leadership. And of course, it has been criticized, but it's based on a book by Robert Greenleaf, Servant Leadership, A Journey into the Nature of Legitimate Power and Greatness. And also in the business world, many have run with this principle of servant leadership and have maintained that it is a much better kind of leadership than some of the other leadership models that are also being practiced. There is the powerful story of servant leadership in Hermann Hessel's novel, The Journey to the East. And although it's quite an old book already, 1932, the German edition. It is a fascinating book because there the main person is HH, and probably that is Hermann Hesse himself. He is the leader of the expedition, but in fact, the servant, Leo, who is there with them, he is the driving force, and he helps them to come to their destination. He is the servant who provides leadership. It is, however, a problem to really realize true servant leadership in the church. And that is also true for the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Maybe one indication is in our nomenclature, the titles that we use for people. In many of the Protestant churches, there is the reverend or the very reverend. In Dutch and in South African, we have the title Domine. And that is derived from the Latin Dominus, which means Lord. And, you know, when you practice or want to practice a model of servanthood, then these are not exactly the titles that emphasize that. They rather emphasize that they are in the spiritual elite. In our church, we use the word office and also officer. Now, if you have a union or a conference or a division, then you have all kinds of people who work there, but you have the 2 or 3 officers, and they are a special group. They have much more power than others have: the president, the secretary, and the treasurer. They are the officers, and that suggests a superior status. They rule rather than serve, it would seem from the word. And you may wonder whether we really should use the word senior pastor. We are not using that because the person is senior in age, but it has a different meaning. There is in a pastoral team a differential. There are lead pastors, and there are similar words that are being used. And that is certainly true in the USA. And then there has been a tendency to start introducing business terms in the nomenclature that is used in the church. We now often hear that the treasurer is being referred to as the chief financial officer, the CFO. And actually, we had a general conference president, Falkenberg, who wanted to introduce the term CEO for himself and for presidents of various church institutions. And I remember I had just begun my work at the Trans-European Division Office. Paulsen was still the president, and he came back from annual council. That's the annual meeting for all the church officials from around the world. He had come back from Washington, and he reported that Falkenberg had suggested that we should start using the term CEO, Chief Executive Officer. And he was not very happy with that. And he then said, well, you know, if we are going to call ourselves something else, then maybe we should be called bishops. Whereupon the treasurer of our division said, well, if you are going to call yourself bishops, what am I going to be called? And so somebody said, well, maybe if you want a biblical term, then we can call you Judas. But you know, the fact that we would introduce those times, that kind of terms, maybe suggests that we are thinking about the nature of church authority in a different way from what we should. I'm just suggesting that maybe something we need to look at and be careful with. There are a number of issues when we talk about the authority in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We note that we have a hierarchical structure, which is very top-down rather than bottom-up. And Ellen White noted that as a result, we always have the danger of kingly power. And the tendency to exert kingly power has been going up and down a little bit, but I think probably most of us would agree that there is a very acute present danger that we are also dealing with kingly power at the top of the hierarchical structure of our church. Another issue is, of course, is the General Conference session. Is that the highest power? Is that where the authority in the church lies? That has been one of the basic discussion points in the struggle for ordination of female pastors. Is the GC session the final authority? An important issue with regard to authority in the Adventist Church is that we are very policy driven and that we are very strict on defining doctrinal authority. 28 fundamental beliefs with some watchdogs like the Biblical Research Institute and various GC committees. Talking further about authority, we have introduced the word compliance. The church says something, it must be done, the organizations must be compliant, and if they are not, then something will need to be done. And the church says, well, if you're not in line, you don't follow policy, if you don't follow the GC, then something needs to be done about that. Compliance discussion. Unity, that's a related issue, is usually understood far too much, at least in terms of uniformity. So authority is an important element, an important issue, and certainly also in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And these are some of the elements that come into play. There has been a historical development of our church structure. It didn't fall from the air, but it developed over time. But the person I'm quoting here, Jeff B. Poole, he's a Baptist, and he suggested that maybe we should not think in terms of structure, because structure has the connotation of rigidity. And he said it would be much better if we could think of the church's organization as a kind of web. That might be a good metaphor. And he is addressing similar problems that also are found in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. He says if we would use the word web, that might indicate flexibility, vulnerability, pliability. That these are some of the words that he uses in this article. And what I like in particular is he says it also has a kind of stickiness. It holds those who move and dwell upon it together. So, well, that's just a kind of in between, maybe thinking of church structure in terms of a web rather than something rigid. May be a good way to start a discussion. Let me say something about authority in the church and bring it a little closer home. There is the role of the pastor. what is the position of those 30,000 plus ministerial workers that we have in the Seventh-day Adventist denomination? We all know that authority faces challenges today. Authority used to be given, and in a sense it still is, but it must more and more also be earned. People must recognize that a person has that what is needed to exercise authority in the true sense of the word. Excuse me. And authority is not just because you have credentials, but because people trust you, because you have expertise, because you have a certain amount of charisma. In the context of authority, there is a relationship to the conference, and the conference has a certain authority over the pastor. Look at the minister's manual. That's a book that describes what the rights and the privileges, etc., the roles of the minister are. And it's interesting to compare different editions. And it used to be much more closely described that the pastor was responsible to the conference president, a very direct kind of authority of the president over the pastor. That has been somewhat softened in more recent editions, but there is a kind of relationship of authority, and the pastor must do certain things and follow the program that the conference president prescribes. And then on the other side, the pastor has also to do with the authority of the local church, the church board, the elders. So it can be quite a complicated situation. He is expected to abide by and to execute church policies, promote church programs. Well, in practice, all these things may be somewhat fluid, certainly in the Western world, but it's clear that there are relationships of authority, and those can be rather complicated when you are dealing with responsible dissent. Because some of the questions that we may ask is, must the pastor or the leader, must he or she always go by the book? We have this famous policy book, the Black Book, and we have the church manual. Is that always to be followed to the letter? How much latitude does the pastor have regarding decision as to who to marry, who to baptize, who to discipline? Now, we know that in practice, there is quite a bit of freedom, either freedom that people take or freedom that they have been given, but there can be many conflicts about, is a pastor entitled to marry a particular couple? Can they baptize particular persons? And do they have to discipline people who do or believe certain things? So how much latitude is there? That has to do with the question, of course, of authority and of possible dissent. Can you, as a pastor, a leader, at some point in the church, someplace in the church, openly criticize church policies? For instance, when it comes to ordination, can you openly criticize the church, or does that have ramifications? Can you voice dissent regarding particular doctrines, in particular with regard to eschatology, the time of the end, Ellen G. White, the sanctuary, ecumenical activities? How much dissent is tolerated? Can you deviate in certain lifestyle aspects. Can you be a pastor and come out of the closet? How do you deal with cohabitations and some other issues? How far can you deviate in certain lifestyle aspects? So all these things are related to authority and the possibility of dissent. Do pastors, and that's not only pastors, but also church members, do they have the freedom to think for themselves? Well, yes, but do they also have the freedom to express those thoughts? Do they always have to be obedient to the directives that come from on high? Or can they voice some dissent? To what extent can they follow their conscience? And when it comes to doctrinal issues, 28 fundamental beliefs, but are they all fundamental in the same way? How much diversity can be accepted? And okay, if you have to remain within limits, what are those limits if you want to remain in the community? Part of the community, belonging to and serving in a community brings responsibilities. I came across this quote, and a pretty old book was being quoted here by Josiah Royce, The Problem of Christianity, 1913. But he defines a community, and I find that a very proper definition, as a group of people who are bound together by the memory of a shared past and the projection of common hopes for the future. So if you have a tendency to dissent and are not in agreement with everything, that you have to remember, I think, that if you want to be part of a community and want to remain part of a community, then remember, a church is a group of people bound together by the memory of a shared past and the projection of common hopes for the future. Continuing in a community requires a reasonable degree of consensus regarding belief and practice. But on the other hand, while we say that, change, development may be needed, and so there may be a kind of conflict. And where do we go with that? Raoul Dedren, one of the leading theologians of the last century in Seventh-day Adventism, wrote in a supplement to the ministry magazine, that's the magazine for the pastors, about church authority. And he emphasized that listening to the voice of the community is not a sign of sheepish, spineless neutralism. That's the word he uses. And I quote, "It is rather a cast of mind that expresses itself in a succession of ways. First, it means the readiness to go beyond the privacy of one's own views and to open up to the persuasion of a broader vision. And then it implies the willingness to reassess one's own position in the light of the church's decision. And third, it means a considerable reluctance to conclude right off that the church's decision is erroneous." So he emphasizes that you have to be careful when you think that you have a different idea or that you want to do things differently. You cannot just go against the voice of the community. You have to listen to the voice of the community before you do anything else. And that is probably well taken. But that's the other side. True authority can never be imposed. It only works when it is offered, chosen, and freely adopted. Personal moral development requires critical thinking and not merely following conventions and conformity to rules. So that's the other side. And when morality is constrained by simply focusing on obedience to moral authorities, we risk not becoming free, choosing responsible individuals. You see the dilemma. On the one hand, there is the need, Advenrtst says, to listen to the community and be careful before you say something that you have really convinced yourself that something needs to be said. But listening to the community is important. On the other hand, obedience, this Michael Kinnaman says, cannot be imposed. You must always have critical thinking and not merely following conventions and conformity, just for the sake of doing everything the same and continuing to believe whatever has always been believed. Reformer Martin Luther modeled proper conscientious dissent when he said that his conscience was captive to the word of God, and that is neither safe nor salutary to go against conscience. Famous statement that Luther said when he stood before the Diet, that it is not safe to go against the word of God. And you have to follow, in the end, your conscience. Ellen White wrote that political and ecclesial authorities sin against God when they compel people to go against their conscience. Well, I know Ellen White has said an awful lot of things, but when it is emphasized that we must obey the brethren and regard the General Conference in session as the final authority, it's also important to note that she gave this kind of statement, that it is a sin against God when the leaders compel people to go against their conscience. The authority of the church must be respected because the church is addressed by the Lord. But the believer is also addressed singly. God speaks also to each person, each one of us singly. Each person is addressed not only by the body of Christ, by the church, but also by the head of that body, the Lord himself. The church has also the obligation, that's the same author, who says has the obligation to listen to and examine the view of the individual believer or pastor. Even if found unacceptable in many respects, such an opinion may contain a part of the truth, which can then be opened up in fuller and richer ways. I'm quoting now from a source, a Dutch source, Johannes van der Ven, Ecclesiology in Context. And this practical theologian, he said, the church is always in need of reformation. And this reformation will never take place without conflict. And then he follows, and maybe we can come back to that also in our discussion. In fact, the reformation of the church depends on conflicts and their balanced treatment. Being without conflicts is often a sign of a low frequency and meager intensity of interactions between members in the church. So he says, if there's no conflict, there is not that much thinking and not much is going on in the church. The church has lost its vitality. So it's not too bad if there is dissent, if there is some conflict, because that's how we can move on. That's how we can correct one another. And then let me see, I'm doing okay, I think, for time. So here are some of my conclusions. There is a point when the tension between the official views of the church and those of an individual pastor or other person rises to a point where the church must take measures to protect its identity and unity. True or false? The church has the right to discipline members, ministers, when they manifest a persistent lack of loyalty and no longer support the essential Adventist beliefs. True or false? No one is forced to remain a member of the church or to continue to serve as a pastor. Church is and remains a voluntary community. If anyone feels that he or she cannot in good conscience support the views and actions of the church, there may be no other option but to leave. Again, true or false? And some more conclusions. A community cannot exist without general consensus about its goals and its self-identity. True or false? But responsible dissent can have a healthy influence and does not necessarily threaten the future of the church. Do we agree or do we not agree? Knowledge of history is important. And that's, I think it's good to deal with some of these people who have been responsible dissenters through the ages. Because when you look at history and you see what has happened, you realize sometimes the church has been wrong. And it has been difficult for the church to learn that lesson and to come to that particular, acceptance of the fact that it was wrong. And when you look at history, you find that dissenters were often pioneers of renewal and reform. And so that should also be an element in when we are meeting with dissent in our time, in our church. What do we do with them? Often in the past, they were pioneers of renewal and reform and have corrected certain opinions that have been proven to be wrong. Dissent, and I think that is probably the most important conclusion, forces the community to reassess its self-understanding. It is therefore important that the community creates channels for the expression of dissent. And if there is anything that I wish, is that that would be true, that a community would create channels for the expression of dissent. And that has been lacking, I would say fatally lacking in recent times in our own denomination. But dissent, if responsible, forces the community to reassess itself, its understanding, its self-understanding. And therefore, it must get a chance to express itself in a responsible way. Well, that is so far what I wanted to say as an introduction for our series today. Back to you, David.
Thank you so much. Perfect. Right on time. So it's 11:30 now. Let's take a 10-minute break and be back at 11:40 California time, and we will continue. I imagine that the discussion could follow along one or the other or both of two lines. On the one hand, we may discuss in a rather abstract way notions of authority and how it is to be understood and exercised and so forth. And or we can talk about specific issues in our own denomination about the exercise of authority. So we can be more abstract or we can be more specific and concrete. So we'll talk about whatever you want to talk about, but let's take a pause now. I'm going to turn off the recording for YouTube, and I'm also going to turn off Facebook. So when we come back, don't let me start without restarting them. Okay, 10 minutes from now. Thank you. Thank you, Reinder.
Thank you.
Okay, if anybody has a question, kind of raise your hand and I'll start the queue. I love that word. We don't use it in America often, but queue. Anyway, just raise your hand. Either, the reaction hand or wave your hand. I'll be looking for you. Thank you.
Q is going to be harder and harder to use now, David.
That's true. Especially if it's anonymous.
Yes.
Good to see you back today, George. Hi, bud. Didn't see you yesterday. I hope you're doing all right today.
Good to see you, Forrest. Branson Legacy Sabbath School presentation is the highlight of my week. It's good to see all the people in the class. It reminds me back in the day when good people met in homes to discuss such interesting issues. And I'm very much appreciative.
Well, we are meeting at homes, bud.
Right. It's great. Might be difficult, David, but it would be great if, in my opinion, if we had the names of people who attend the class and their email addresses so we could speak directly with them from time to time. It might be an imposition, but it seems like it would be a step in the right direction to be able to communicate.
Yeah, most of us are probably on Facebook too. So messages could go there through Messenger, individual.
I'll have to write the names down and see if I can see you on Facebook.
Bud,
Yes,
this is Bronwyn. We would have to have permission to do that, I think. So if somebody in the class would like to take that on and people can put their emails in the chat and then they can be gathered, those who would like to do that, that's possibly a way to go.
So that the chat is a format in Facebook, is it?
Yeah, and I don't think I think we had another discussion on this where emails were in the chat. Somebody had to go through and individually take them out. Because
Yes.
when this is broadcast on Facebook, it has the chat with it. So I would suggest if we're going to do the email thing, we do it some other way than on these videos.
Okay.
Terry, where are you located, may I ask?
I'm north of Seattle on Whidbey Island.
Whidbey Island, I'm thinking I have a classmate there from Adelphian. Gosh, she has a PhD in biology and taught at La Sierra for several years. Clayton, Dale Clayton, is that a familiar name to you?
Not offhand, no.
Yeah,
He lives on Whidbey also.
I'm pretty sure he does, he and his wife.
There's a church at the north end.
I don't live far away either.
Where are you at?
Where do you live, Ruth?
Mill Creek, just north of Seattle,
Oh, yeah.
right close to where a number of other people are located here that are coming to this group.
On Friday evenings, I go through book by book with a group of people. Primarily, they're in the Portland, I would say Seattle area, maybe that area, northwestern area for sure.
You can get in touch with me then somehow. However you need to.
Yeah,
I go to
Where are you
Green.
located, Edwin?
I'm in Redlands, California.
I think there are several ways to do this without putting it out on the chat here. Anybody that is a friend with one of us, all you have to do is go look at their list of who they are friends with. And they can get you in contact, number one. Number two, you, like Bronwyn said, under Facebook, if you are on Facebook, you can message people even if you aren't their friend.
Yeah.
And then you can get it from there also. Which can be a problem for a lot of people, which is why my husband will never be on Facebook because of it.
Does anybody see Simone this morning?
Yes,
I'm trying to remember where she.
I'm here.
And where, I don't see your name, just, oh, there it is. Simone, are you in California perchance?
No, I'm in state of Washington.
What year did you graduate from the medical school in Loma Linda?
I didn't go to Loma Linda.
Okay. All right. And my brother graduated in '68 and my son in '94, I believe.
I graduated in 1991.
Anyway, where did you go to school?
University of Zagreb in Croatia.
I'm just so impressed with your comments over time. Very much appreciate your thinking.
Thank you.
And Ron Koppel is a familiar name back in the Loma Linda days too. Seems to me that he was a State Farm rep. Is that right, Ron? Don't know if he's still there or not. Of course, I knew Ed Turner when he was in the seminary back in the day, when I was at Andrews as an assistant dean of men. Was that 69? I remember seeing Burl and her husband at Loma Linda once or twice in the Centennial Complex. And never met her, but I see her regularly for a long way. And, Jeff Kale is highly respected. I remember my son speaking so highly of Jeff Kale as a professor at Loma Linda. And Margie Lunt and that kitten of hers is a special breed of cat. Pretty special, I believe.
Hey, bud. This is Margie Lunt.
Hi, Margie. Good to see you. Good.
Yeah, my little kitty cat is a rag doll and she's getting big. She's already 11 pounds. So
How old is she?
she's only 9 months.
She certainly is a beautiful cat.
Hey,
She's a
Margie,
lot of fun.
Margie,
Yeah,
my cat's prettier than your cat.
well, I'm glad you think so.
May I interrupt just for a second before we get started? Here's a poll, and I don't know how to see the results of the poll. Can you all see this document saying Untitled Poll on your screen?
Not yet.
No.
No.
Okay. Well, let's do it. I will get over and start Facebook up again, and we will get going here.
That's an interesting poll.
So, Bud, I was just going to make a comment that my son went through med school and his very favorite professor through medicine was Jeff Kale also.
Interesting.
What kind of cat is that?
It's a rag doll,
Oh, very nice.
cross between a Persian and a Burmese.
Yeah, beautiful.
Most of the time she acts beautiful, but she has a little bit of spice in her.
Cats are cats.
Yep.
Did you have to refinance the farm to buy her?
Well, almost.
Okay, here we go on live. Here we go on Facebook. Now I'm going to try again to find that icon.
Well, it says we're recording on Zoom. I may not have turned it off. So I don't know that we're recording on Zoom. We are on Facebook, I think. well, up in the upper left, to the left of live on Facebook, it says recording and there's a cloud there.
Does it? Does it say
Yeah.
recording?
Yes, it does.
Okay, let's go then. Let me see here. All right. Okay, here we go. Forrest, can you get us started?
Yeah, I can do that. I don't have any hands up, but I would like to ask a question of our learned friend from the Netherlands. Thank you for your presentation, Reinder. I do find it kind of suspicious that you're going to start out with two Dutchmen. I think maybe we need to have, there's a conflict of interest on it. But I have a question, on all those policy and all those things, I agree with them. And I also disagree with them. I just wonder if sometimes we don't get into binary thinking rather than nuanced thinking, that, there's a place for certain policies. There's also a place for dissent. Would you mind commenting on that, about nuanced thinking rather than binary thinking?
Yes. Well, I hope that we're going to have a discussion with all the members of the group.
Yeah, I've got one hand up, come up now, but we'll get some more here.
Because I certainly do not have a ready-made answer to most of the questions that could be asked. But I tried at least to show in this introductory talk that there are a number of two sides to it. On the one hand, you need a certain amount of authority, call it also structure or a web or whatever, and there needs to be a reasonable amount of consensus and of having the same goals. That on the one hand, and you need to protect that, I think. And there are moments when you may have to actually be sure that you maintain that degree of unity. But on the other hand, then there must be a possibility for people to talk together. What we are doing in this class must not be something that is somewhat unorthodox or is somewhat on the margin, but this must be normal in the church, that we can talk about things together and that we can have difference of opinions. And pastors should not be as afraid as they often are to speak their mind, because it may have repercussions for their career, etc., etc. So there must be this somehow balance between, yes, we are together in this, and on the other hand, yes, we don't know all the answer, and we are searching together. When it comes to policies, etc., sure, you need policies. Whether we need as many as we have. If you have seen the Black Book lately, it has grown tremendously in just 1 or 2 decades. There's always a loophole that and a hole that needs to be plugged. And so I sometimes wonder whether we need as many policies. And I certainly am one to stress that in applying policies, there ought to be also a certain flexibility. And that in many cases, we must be sure that mercy precedes, what would be the word to, strict compliance. So, but yeah, and I hope that when we have when we continue our discussions, that we will allow, or that the church will allow for dissent without less anxiety that it often has. As if the church is falling apart if somebody says something about 1 or 2 doctrines or about 1 or 2 practices. We ought to probably also believe that if the Spirit has anything to do with the church, then the Spirit will help us to, I think, to continue to grow and to find more truth and not be so afraid that a little bit of digression from the path that has been stipulated by the powers that be. There should not be that anxiety, that fear, that is so dangerous. In fact, I think that what this scholar van der Ven said, that it is a sign of vitality of a church when you have lively discussions, and also when people do not agree at all points. As long as there is enough that binds us together. And we often spend more time emphasizing where we disagree than looking for the stuff where we agree. And when you compare our denomination with many other families of faith or denominations, then we may not think so, but we have more of a unity than most confessional families have.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you very much. I want to go to Simona. Simona, you're on.
Thank you. So, when I think about dissent as well as how we deal with it, I think about three things. One is, what is the motive? Second, what is the purpose? And third, what is the outcome? And I think that sometimes we take our discussions about dissent and how we deal with it sort of in a vacuum without thinking about these three aspects. Because there are many reasons why people may dissent. There are many motivations, and we have to think particularly about the outcome. Is the outcome going to be beneficial? Is it going to build things? Is it going to allow us to become better people? Is it going to allow us to become a better church? And so in that respect, I think sometimes we err both on both ends. Sometimes we allow for discussions that are really destructive and that hurt people. And sometimes we quash discussions that are meant to make us better and provide us a better insight in certain things. And I really like that quote that you mentioned, that Ellen White said that, we should not crush somebody's conscience. It's a very important part of how we dissent and how we deal with the dissent. And the second thing I wanted to say, sometimes when people talk about this is God's will and this is, what is guiding them, it's not necessarily God's will, it is how we see God's will. And so we have people who have very distorted view of God, that God is somebody who is, against freedom, who is very rigid in the rules of who is acceptable and who's not acceptable. And so they transfer those views into the way how they dissent or how they deal with the dissent. And I think that that's something that we also need to take into account.
Yes. Well, starting with your second question, Simona, I think that is true. And that is that we often look at how we see God's will. But that is true for all of us. And so we must always be willing to allow for that aspect also in our own argumentation. And I think that for most of us, it is probably true that we do think on certain issues differently than we did 25 or 30 years ago. And so we have, I would hope, undergone a development in our thinking. And we see some of these aspects of God's will differently now from how we saw them in the past. And that is something we must also recognize, that other people are at a particular point in their religious development. And so they may not yet see things as we do, but they may come to that conclusion if they have more time. Or, well, you know, that is something that is important to note, that we are not all at the same point in our thinking and development, and we must allow for that, and must allow for the fact that we also are biased and see things from a particular perspective. There's simply no other way around it, as long as we are human. The first point, yeah, I agree with you that we should not dissent simply because we want to be awkward, or because we want to be in the spotlight, or we want to make ourselves important. But when we love our church, and when we are looking for truth, these are big words, but when that is the motive, then yes, we have a right to a right, but we must search and we must talk about it, but not always, and maybe not to everyone, and not maybe under all circumstances. Responsible dissent is important, because as you say, we want to build the church rather than destroy the church. So yes, and there must be a certain, the points that we try to make, or that dissenters try to make, they must have some weight, they must be of some importance, because not all struggles are worth fighting. But when we see things that we hope can somehow be changed and should be changed, we believe, and when there are some points in our theology that we feel need to be discussed, then there must somehow be a responsible way of doing that. And the church, it will be for the betterment of the church, for the growth of the church, if the church allows for that and is not so very afraid for any dissenting voice. Does that make sense, Simona?
Yes, it does. And I agree with you. You know, there is a famous poem of a poet from my home country. He talks about a metaphor of tall poplar trees as people who are always straining to bring other people up. And they're leaders of thought and leaders of ideas that are progressive, that lead towards something better. But by default, because of what they are also somewhat isolated and more often buffeted by strong winds, right? So, you know, I think it's really important for us to give people the chance to talk about things, but we also need to consider, is this important? You know, there are some minor things that we often hang our head on and talk about that really don't bring any real change. You know, I remember that famous discussion of how many angels fit on the tip of a needle. It's an irrelevant point, but it was very, very fiercely fought. So sometimes, you know, we need to consider, you know, the relevance of the issue as well, and provide an environment in which dissent can be done in a respectful and good way, but sometimes you know, there are things that are worth fighting for, no matter what the outcome for that person.
Right.
Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you, Simona. I'd like to go to George at this time. George?
Okay. I guess you can hear me, right?
I can.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, well, I was thinking that through history, progress has been attained more often when there was dissent than otherwise. There must be some challenge to the establishment in order to change and to make it better, the establishment. So, but again, conflict increases always when the establishment starts exerting the authority improperly, blocking freedom and this kind of things. So is there a line? The question here, one question is, in our church, where should be a line that the CEOs, let's say, should not cross in terms of using authority, because it can become abuse of authority and then we have more conflict. It's complicated. How much the members' freedom to think and to express their thoughts should be tolerated or not. So I'm sure you have some comments on this. Where is the line? Because on once we have leadership, that's what is needed in church, is leadership. But if the authority is increased too much, it becomes abuse of authority. So, and to a point when we hear things like, well, unity and uniformity are the same things. For this GC, for example, no, unity is one thing, uniformity is very different. So when the GC starts, tries to impose unity equals uniformity, we got a bigger problem here. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, you ask about 10 different questions,
Sorry.
It is very difficult to change a particular tendency that has been going on for quite some time. When our church started, there was a certain amount of freedom. Not everybody was thinking the same on all the different doctrinal points. But gradually, it was felt that we should have a body of teachings that was more or less, final, complete. And that tendency has, over time, become stronger. And we have seen that in particular when, after we had formulated the 28 fundamental beliefs, we just a few years ago felt that we needed to plug a few holes in one or two of those beliefs and make them even more final than they were. And of course, at the same time, it was emphasized more and more that a true Adventist will be in agreement or will give assent to all 28 fundamental beliefs. Well, once you have established that this is a more or less complete final body of truth, you make it very difficult to have open discussions about any of those 28 fundamental beliefs. And, the reality is that in our church today, there is a lot of talk about one or two of these points. Dr. Bull has been dealing with one particular issue the last couple of weeks. about geology and about creation, etc. This is not just an isolated person here or there who is talking about that. Most of the, well, at least many of people who have done any reading in these fields, have done any study, have come to the conclusion that we must look again at some of the points that we have made in, what is it, point number 6, I believe it is. Take the issue of the heavenly sanctuary with 1844, etc. Now, there are so many people all around the world who are putting some questions that you will have to allow for at least the possibility of discussing that, looking at that again, and maybe formulating the doctrine in a different way that is more satisfying and more in line, of course, with what we feel, or many feel, that the Bible is actually teaching. But this is not the way we are going at present. The way we're going at present is in the opposite direction. It is just simply ignoring that these questions exist. And everybody who is trying to put questions mark is kind of suspect. And that is where we need some kind of different mentality, where it becomes possible to actually talk about these things without becoming suspect. And if we don't do that, then that will cause, it will come at a very high cost, I believe. If a church is not willing to look at some of the things, and that's true for any kind of church or any kind of organization, if you simply want to close your eyes to some of these things that are being questioned, then people will give up, people will leave, or people will simply ignore. And that is what's happening at a large scale. So that is, I think, why it's an important topic that we are discussing. There must be place for responsible dissent. And as Simona said, if that is done with the right motivation and with a view at the outcome that it will better the church, it will help the church to understand certain things better. But George, that is, it means a change in mentality at some level.
Yeah, thank you for the comments. I'm also concerned with like the silence. The church usually or most often uses silence to deal with problems, kind of ignoring, head in the sand. It's happening now with Steve Daly. He published a very serious book, very well documented, and a very troublesome book. And so far, I didn't see any reaction from the church. I see just silence. And it's troublesome. Yeah, thank you.
You know, we can think differently about that book. I think it was very aggressive, and there are certain things that I don't like about the book. But you cannot ignore something like that.
Yeah.
And the church must come with some kind of response. And that has, well, so far, the church has been strangely silent. Is there no answer? That is what some people suspect.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, George. Thank you.
Thank you.
I would like to go to Peter at this time. Peter, you're up.
Thank you again, Dr. Bruinsma, for your presentation. To understand how the authority evolved in the church, I think it will help us to look a little bit historically how this evolved. In the beginning, the church had the collective authority. We remember from Acts the Council of Jerusalem about 50 AD, when the apostles got together and they discussed certain problems that appear in the church, and they came up with a collective decision and they recommended to the churches to follow. As long as the apostles live, it was their authority, they have their prestige recognized as those that walk with Jesus. But after the apostle died, a period of approximately 250 years of persecution started with some intermittencies. And during this time, the role of the bishops increased. And the prestige of the bishops in the Christian church also increased because many of them suffered martyrdom. The role of the bishops in the church also increased even more when Constantine recognized Christianity. Emperor Constantine recognized Christianity as one of the official religions of the Roman Empire. Constantine not only recognized their authority in the church, but the role of the bishops, especially the moral role and the judicial role of the bishops, increased during Constantine because he made them the last judges. That if somebody was submitting to a bishop a problem, the bishop came up with the final decision. And also during Constantine, the Christian church came up with a formulation of the Christian creed, Christian belief. And also the role of the bishops also was recognized as those that were combating the heresies that appear in the church. And of course, further on, the church had major decisions taken during councils, but also the role of the bishops, local bishops, was recognized in the church. And I'll stop for now right here. And in this way, we can understand the things that are happening today in our church, how the role of pastors and leadership evolved, and why do we have what we have. And also somebody raised the problem of that some of the opinions are looked at with suspicion. Well, I believe this is an influence of the political correctness that exists in the larger society and that penetrated also the church.
Okay. So that is more of a statement than of a question. But let me try to react by saying that I see one of the problems in the first place, well, so that's two. In the first place, the aspect that we just discussed in response to a previous question, and that is when you formulate a body of doctrine and say that's more or less the final form, then you are repeating some of the mistakes actually that happened in the earlier centuries. When the body of doctrine became so rigid. And that is something that certainly also the reformers were fighting against. And then just a century or two later, this was the overall situation in Protestant Christianity, that the creeds were so rigid that it was impossible to to actually come with any new idea. And that was why early Adventism said, we don't want that. And we want a more open system. And but we have not succeeded in doing that. We have actually ended up also with a closed system of doctrine, even though we have a preamble that says that it's possible to change from time to time. But I don't know whether you agree with this, but when I say that, unfortunately, at least I find that unfortunate, there is too much influence by administrator on formulating doctrine. Theologians are often what is the word that I'm looking for? Sidelined, and the administrators take hold of the process of formulating doctrine and defending doctrine. Now, for instance, when the changes were made just a few years ago, very few of our theologians were actually asked to participate in the discussion. There were a few people around the administrators and the administrators themselves that felt very strongly about certain points. And it is important, I believe, for the health of the church that we realize that the theologians in their, let's say, in their diversity also help the church formulating doctrine. And that is not a primary task for the administrators. Yes, they may have to facilitate certain processes, and they may have to warn maybe when certain processes are taking place. But the role of the theologians is, in my view, sometimes and lately more than is good, being de-emphasized.
Well, I agree with you, but I think you may agree with me that the formulation of doctrine can have a negative in some respects.
The formulation of what?
The formulation of doctrine.
Yeah, okay.
Doctrine in Christian church could have some negative aspects, but also positive aspects. And what I mean by positive is the fact that was combating heresies. And as you know, many strange ideas, many heresies also appear in the Christian church.
And today also?
My personal belief is that we will not have a Christian church today if was not formulated a certain doctrine to put together the many things that the Christians believe in.
Sure.
Because you know, again, that many strange ideas developed through centuries. Many people came with very strange ideas, and where we'll be today with adopting that.
I fully agree, and I feel that that sure we need to formulate what we believe in some way, because if you don't formulate what you believe, if you don't try to formulate, then very soon you won't believe very much.
That's right.
But at the same time, you always, when you formulate, that is something that is always professional, because there is always more to know about it. There's always more insight that you need. When you have put a statement together, you need to step back and you have to say, well, that's the best we can do. And we may have to come back to it. We most certainly may have to come back to it. And so, yes, and when you see dangerous heresies, and there are some in our church today, you need to deal with that. And maybe the authorities in the church, the the administrative leaders may have a task to trying to curtail the influence of some who distribute those heresies, rather than actually promoting them, as they sometimes do. But that's a whole different area, possibly. But theologians need to help the church to know and to formulate what they believe. They are not infallible, and we need the plurality of our theologians in order to help the church. We need them on the left and we need them on the right. You know, the people who tend to be on the left, we need those to ask the kind of questions that we need to answer. And maybe sometimes we need the people on the other side to provide us with some of the answers.
Thank you. Agree.
Okay, I'd like to go to Terry Dunder at this time.
Well, I started all the way back at the beginning with my comment, my thought, because you made a comment at the very beginning that for our church, its monetary needs haven't really changed. And I thought to myself, but many other things have changed. And I think one of the things that has changed dramatically is that we are now questioning authority more than we ever have before. And I just think that Christ came, and I think he's quoted in John 10:16 as talking about he has other sheep that are not of his fold. Mm-hmm. And in Matthew 9, those who are not against us are for us. And if we distill our Christian beliefs down to its very core principle, which is God is love, people should be allowed to accept that and be accepted into unity, even if they're not uniform at all. Otherwise, God is not for everyone. And I can't accept that. And that is not a question, that's a comment. The question would be, do you think the church is even capable of changing to that degree?
Can you have questions that are a little bit easier to answer? Because I don't know how to answer that question, whether the church is capable. You know, if we are looking at how the church has changed over time, then, you know, the story is not just negative.
No.
The church has changed, and our church has changed also in many ways. The church is changing right now, although lately I wonder whether it's changing in the direction that I would prefer.
Absolutely.
And that is most worrisome.
Yeah.
You know, we need to be prepared to see that change is slow. But to see actually some of the things undone and to see some of the things being reversed, yeah, that is worrisome.
Well, I think the freedom and the liberty Christ taught covers those who want to believe as the LGBT people believe. Mm-hmm. It's fine if they want to believe that way, but they should not tell other people by their actions, their words, and their way of talking that they are not saved. They cannot be saved. I think that's heresy.
But, you know, it's very difficult to know what will happen in the near future.
I agree.
And it seems to me that there has been a significant change in the authority of the higher organizations in the Corona time. You know, the fact that leaders from divisions and General Conference have not been traveling at all, and they have not been involved in many of the things that the churches now had to deal with. Local churches had to sort out what they were going to do, how they were going to be church. And it seems to me that a lot of the authority has shifted actually to the local churches in the past year or and a half or 2 years. Now, is that going to be a permanent feature? Then there is going to be a General Conference session. What is it, in next summer? Will that mean reinforcement of the same kind of leadership, or will there be a change?
We can hope.
We can hope, but that's difficult to see. And some of the things that are happening are not hopeful.
In the world too.
Yeah. So the whole thing of authority, it's something that it's difficult to prophesy how it's going to be. And one thing that you refer to, I think there is a much stronger sense on the part of lots of Seventh-day Adventists that they are not the only people of God.
Amen.
That is, I think, something that you hear much more widely than maybe even a few decades ago. So that's another challenge, that if Seventh-day Adventists will see a role for itself, it needs to be open, but yet it also needs to define itself in a way that makes sense and that attracts people. And how do we do that?
Attracts people to God.
Yes. And how do you do that without saying we are the only ones who can do that?
Thank you. I really always appreciate your comments.
Yeah.
They're great. Thank you.
Well, lots of questions for the future of the Roy Branson legacy class, David.
Okay. It's to you now, David, to ask your question.
I see Ed, then I have just a very, very brief comment. We'll have the benediction.
You want me to get Ed first then before you? Okay.
Yes, please.
Okay, Ed, you're up bat.
Yeah, thank you, Reinder, for what you said. I'm sorry I missed out on the first half. But all this discussion about questions, I'm reminded in my early studies in communication theory that two things have always been with me, and that is, number one, questions direct thought. And number two, the quality of your questions determines the quality of the response. So, here's some examples. I could say, well, wouldn't you agree that we need to hold true our historic positions? There's an assumption in that question. I could say it, how's it possible to reconcile these 2 points? And I read a blog of an article of Reinder's just, I guess, the last day or two. He talks about a cup of tea and the importance of that in leadership. And people could say, well, don't you know that tea drinking is not allowed in our community? Or I could say, what does tea drinking, Reinder, have to do with leadership? So learning that the way we question is important. It's very, very important. It's all part of the academic process. It's how we grow. But how we question is really the significant thing. Thank you.
Well, I'm surprised that apparently so many people read some of the stuff that I write, and I had expected also that the question would come up why I would use the the example of tea drinking at all, because we don't drink tea, right? But I admire that person who made that statement, and the former mayor of Amsterdam, and his leadership was very, very effective in bringing people together and holding them together. And so, but he made that statement that was highly criticized also in the Dutch media, that what we need to do is drink more tea together. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Well,
Thank you, Reinder. I'd like to now, David, to you, and that you'll be the end of the official recording of this meeting.
Okay, after I have a brief comment, we'll have the benediction, and then I will turn off the recording and I will turn off Facebook, but I'll leave Zoom on without it being recorded, and people can stay by and talk as long as they want. Zoom will turn itself off when it hears no voices for a while. Here's a fact. The United Methodist Council consists of 80 different denominations. The Lutheran World Federation consists of 148 denominations. The World Communion of Reformed Churches includes 230 different denominations. We have one denomination worldwide, and we're trying to do something that no other Protestant denomination is trying to do. So I think we can move in a helpful direction, not by eliminating the General Conference entirely, but by devolving more discretion to the divisions. That tendency is already underway, but if we could make each division much more independent, that would be helpful. And here's a very concrete suggestion. Have the executive committee meet only once a year, not twice, only once a year. That would force the divisions to take more leadership in their own areas. So we are the one Protestant denomination who's trying to do this worldwide with one organization. And I think we need to learn from our colleagues. I've talked to people in other denominations about this, and they are amazed that we're even trying to do what we're doing. And I think rightly so. Okay.
Yeah,
thank you, Reinder, too.
Yeah, we do have maybe one other denomination, the Reformed Adventists. They are not under our umbrella, but really they're pretty insignificant worldwide when you see. They have about 35,000 members, mostly in South America now. But yeah, it's remarkable how united we have remained. Of course, there Ellen White has done us a great favor by saying that, when people say, people should not say that the church has become Babylon and so they should leave the church. No, she has said that we should never come to that conclusion, but stay together. And so that has, I think, been a significant factor.
I agree. Thank you so much, Reinder. Erasmus next week, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
Okay, a good Dutchman.
Good Dutchman, yes.
Right. Okay, here we go. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen.
Amen.
Dr. Bull. Hi, David. Dr. Bull, can you hang out for 5 minutes, 2 minutes?